and this is the Convict Australia podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Hi everyone, I would just like to start by acknowledging the Darrell-speaking people, who are the traditional custodians of this land, and I pay my respects to elders both past, present and future. So today I have a very special guest with me, historian Michel Wilson. Welcome to the show, Michel.
Thank you for having me, Jennifer. And I'd also like to say, pay my respects to the elders of the Darug Nation on which I'm broadcasting to you from today. I live and work on Darug country in Parramatta. So
for those who don't know Michel, she is an expert when it comes to the history of Parramatta. In fact, if you've ever done a tour of some of the historic buildings in Parramatta, Michel may well have been your guide. Michel is particularly knowledgeable about one very interesting person in our history, Reverend Samuel Marsden, who is also known as the Flogging Parson. Michel is here to tell us a bit about the many sides of Marsden. So Michel, could you start off by telling us a bit about his early life before he came to Australia?
I would really love to. However, a lot of Samuel's life prior to coming to Australia is just not known. So what we do know is that he was born in Yorkshire, 1765. June 24th is the date most people choose. However, some people think he was a year earlier. Most of us would argue that his father was a blacksmith and a small farmer, landholder, but there are other people who say that that's not correct. We know that he didn't really have a good education in his youth, but he was at a much later age, after being a part of the evangelical movement in the Anglican Church, even though his parents we think were Wesleyans rather than Anglicans, taken to the grammar school at Hull, and then he was supported by the Church of England to attend college in Cambridge and doing a theological degree, which he didn't actually finish. How
did he become appointed in New South Wales?
Well,
was this something he sought out, or did they force this position upon him?
No, they were having trouble because we only had one Anglican minister out here at the time, Reverend Richard Johnson, and he needed assistance. And it wasn't until 1794 that the Marsdens actually came to Australia.
And when you say the Marsdens, was he married?
He was.
So when did he get married?
I'll read out his letter of proposal in a minute.
Ooh.
To Elizabeth. But what it was he was under the patronage of very powerful men in the Church of England, like William Wilberforce, and he was the reason he didn't finish his degree in Cambridge was because he was appointed to Australia, or suggested as someone, because it was very hard to get people to come out to New South Wales.
Yeah, and this is so very early on too.
It is, yeah, especially in that role at 1794. So he was staying, when he was in Hull, hang on, I've got it here, he met the daughter of William Friston. And they became friends through church groups and Bible readings and Bible study. Could say Elizabeth and Samuel came to know each other. So when he knew that he was going to be coming out to New South Wales, he wrote a letter of proposal, and it's dated London, March 14th, 1793. Dear Betsy, and Elizabeth Friston was known as Betsy.
Yeah.
I have not had an opportunity to thank you for the scripture characters before now. Since I came to London, my time and thoughts being so very much engaged, I hope you will not consider this as a mark of my disrespect, but rather look upon my peculiar situation as a sufficient apology for my conduct in this thing. Since my lot is now seemingly cast, and God appears to be opening my way to carry the gospel of his Son to distant lands, the time has come for me to lay open my thoughts to you, which have long been hid in my own breast. I shall venture to submit to your consideration the following important question, and in parentheses, it's got praying at the same time that the Lord would enable you to answer it agreeable to his own will, and in such a way as may conduce to your own happiness and mine. The question is this: will you go along with me? If, upon considering the subject, you can answer in the affirmative and say, I am willing, then my heart, as far as it is proper, I should give it to the creature, and all I have are yours. And he didn't have very much. I believe it be for my good and his glory. He will provide me with an helpmate. And if not, he will give me a mind resigned to his will. So he has given her an out there, you know. I persuade myself I should be happy in the enjoyment of you more than any other. Yet I do not wish to purchase my own peace at the expense of your comfort. So again, she's got an out. But only if you think you would be happy. Then I cheerfully offer you my hand and my heart whenever you please. I remain, dear Betsy, yours most affectionately, S. Marsden.
Wow, I didn't know that existed.
It's a beautiful thing. And it shows, for me anyway, they didn't start off as the person we find even 10 years later dealing with colonial Sydney and Parramatta.
So what I find really interesting is that she knew what she was getting herself in for. Like, you know, the First Fleet had gone over. They would have known about the starving colony. How gutsy of her to enter this relationship and know that she was going over there.
Most definitely.
Oh, how scary.
Most definitely. We don't actually know a lot as such about Elizabeth Preston, but the Powerhouse Museum holds her wedding dress that she brought with her and was reworked as the wedding dress for their daughter Anne when she got married. It's actually my screensaver on my phone. It's not, for me, that's not the Marsden side, but I'm a fashion tragic when it comes to you know, historical fashion. So when I saw that dress, it formed part of an exhibition about 6 years ago at the Powerhouse of wedding dresses from 1788 in Australia right through to modern times. So,
I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, and it's amazing we have it.
It is.
So
was she pregnant before they left, or she fell pregnant on board?
She fell pregnant on the voyage. So, and I think it was about 10 days before they came into Sydney Cove, Samuel was delivering.
Yes, and I hear it was a pretty dramatic entrance to the world too.
Yeah, to be born during a storm, and for someone, I think, any husband in a way who's never come across that sort of thing before, probably fairly traumatic. And
they had no help on board, did they?
No. And pretty much as soon as she was born, that they were closed into their cabin due to storm. So it was fairly horrific, and it wasn't the last time that Elizabeth had issues during the birth, and she suffered a stroke during the birth of her last child. And
I believe a wave crashed into the cabin and they both got water, the baby and everything got sprayed with water, and the whole, like, the bed linen, everything was saturated.
Yes, that's right. Just so to survive that, and there's got to be something pushing this couple through these events. And I think there's one thing that everybody who comes to look at Samuel Marsden would agree on, and that is that at the base of all of his decisions in the early years, to be sure, was his belief in evangelical Christianity, and that was his purpose in life, was to spread the gospel as far as he could. So
you can get a sense of that dedication just in the proposal to his future wife. That's
this is
how
what I have
important.
to do. Yeah,
Yep.
That's right. How important it is, and I would love you to come and do that with me. So it is. To me, it just took me back when I first read that and reminded me that underneath all of these people is the same humanity that drives us today, that has driven people, for all of human existence, and probably will. And that is, need for companionship and love and support.
Yeah.
So, and he found that there was, Elizabeth was quite a close companion, confidant. He, as far as we know, he spoke to her about issues, discussed things with her, because a little bit like the MacArthurs, they're out here together. They're a unit,
A team,
so, yeah, a team. So much so that when she does have the stroke, he builds her a special carriage, because her whole, memory's going here. I'm pretty sure it was her whole left side that was affected. And she was a inveterate horse rider, loved riding around Parramatta, and then later on with the children being in a coach and going visiting. So he built her a special coach so that she could still take daily drives around Parramatta, and be able to be seen and say hello, but not to be seen as a cripple sort of thing, which was, again, it's a lovely thing to do. And when you juxtapose that against the man that is in the pages of a lot of books, and for me it was like, wow. So,
makes him such an interesting character.
It gives him a humanity that I think that hasn't been projected in a lot of other things. So
So I believe he on the voyage he clashed with the convicts, the crew, the captain. And we're lucky enough to have his journals as well.
We are. I'm going to be honest with you here. Again, the voyage is not my sort of big area, but you are right in that he did clash. And again, it reminded me of the journey out of the MacArthurs 3 years earlier, or 3 and a bit years earlier. And it just showed that he wasn't prepared. Those type of clashes show that he believes he's due inherent respect as a minister of the church. And he was lucky. I think the ship they came out on, I've got it somewhere, did not, that's right, the William was not carrying convicts. So it had cargo and supplies coming out. So in that way, he was lucky. But as I said, it's just his whole focus was being on sermonizing, delivering the message of the gospel. And if that was ever impeded in any way, that was when he got very upset. Because that's his role. So yeah,
and I can imagine being around some
that's right,
some sailors. There might have been
exactly right.
there.
That's exactly right. So clashing with the people, that the sailors on board, the language. Marsden was known for not tolerating cussing, you might want to call it, swearing, that type of language. So so that would have been in the presence of his wife, that would have upset him quite a bit.
So when they arrived,
when
they arrived, where was he assigned?
They were in Sydney with the Johnsons, and then they had a small, where are we? I've got the exact location. They were in with the Johnsons for a while, And then they came to stay at Parramatta, and they were accommodated at the officers' barracks, which are at the bottom of George Street. So if you're in Parramatta today and you go past the Gasworks Bridge, so you're driving down George Street, the Gasworks Bridge is on your left, and as soon as you've gone past that, the officers' barracks for Parramatta were on your right. So, and they were a two-storey building. So they were there, and then they moved you probably call it 3 times in Parramatta. So they had a small cottage, which was built for them on the corner of Marsden, what came to be known as Marsden and George, which is where the Woolpack Hotel stands today.
Okay.
And it's still there. So they had a small 2-room cottage, and they had another, we'll call them huts. So there was one hut for the Marsdens to live in, and the other was for Marsden to preach. So, and of course, his congregation was at that time convicts and officers. And neither of those people really wanted to be in the church. So.
Yeah. So when did he get appointed as magistrate?
That was, sorry, hang on a minute. Dates are not my strong point, but it was in
That's okay, but I think it was quite early on, wasn't it?
Oh, it was 1795, 1796. So magistrates in England often comprised members of the clergy.
Oh, okay.
But it was a different type of magistracy. So they're dealing with, I would call them, I suppose, petty crimes and things. And
a lot of convicts reoffending.
Exactly, but they were not that you would know more about how it went on than me in that respect. But they didn't deal with the massive, big trials or anything like that. But a magistrate in the
day-to-day
was going to have to deal with everything. And before he left for the colony, William Wilberforce actively pointed out to Samuel that it was not going to be a good thing for him if he was offered this position, because Wilberforce felt that he was going to be offered the position, a position of magistrate.
And did he have did he have a choice? Like,
of course,
or was there a big pressure to accept this role?
No. He had a choice. Pressure on Marsden to do anything other than what Marsden wanted to do did not come into Marsden's life until Lachlan Macquarie arrived in the colony.
Right.
Yeah. So Marsden had the choice to accept the role, and he chose to accept it. And there are several factors that probably led Samuel into choosing that. So if we look back at where most of us believe he came from, was not exactly the upper levels of society in Yorkshire. And so if you're coming out to a place like this and you don't have status where you've come from, other than the role he's been given as a clergyman, it would be hard not to say no, wouldn't it? Because you're looking at lifting your family to another level by taking this role. And that is what a lot of people, and I believe too, led him to say, yes, I'll take it. It's a rise in status. So the other thing that is argued to be behind Samuel taking on this role is the English versus the Irish in Anglicanism versus Catholicism, and also a way for him to perhaps enforce attendance at the sermons on Sunday, which were never, you had to go, and physically you could be there, but your head wasn't in it, especially if you were a Catholic. So this role allowed Samuel to deal with all of those things going on in his head that he thought would assist him. And perhaps, we don't know, but he thought it might bring Anglicanism and the gospel to a wider audience who really, in his view, needed to be saved. These were people who needed to be saved. So, but as Wilberforce was proven to be correct, Samuel taking that role led directly to the Flogging Parson nickname.
So can you tell us a bit more about that, about the types of, the severity of the sentences he was handing down?
Okay, to do that, I'm going to start with, it actually goes back to the relationship between the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church. So flogging, like all about flogging and the naval punishments and how the cat of nine tails, was manufactured and what its job was to do. And so this was seen as a punishment of choice in the Navy. It was not unusual. But as what, it's hard for me to sort of put into words, the way Samuel Marsden utilised these particular punishments was mostly against the Catholic convicts who came up in front of him. And the worst example that we have is from 1800.
Is that the Irish uprising?
No, this is before.
Right.
So when you look at Marsden's relationship with the governors, he arrives after Philip's gone. You've got the Rum Corps coming up to their rise. You've got Gross and Johnson sort of running the colony, and then Hunter. And Hunter and Marsden get on really well, right? There's no enmity between them. Hunter believes in Marsden, what Marsden feels is his duty here. He believes in all the tenets of, marriage, stable society, going to church on Sunday. However, in 1798 in Ireland, of course, there's the Battle of Vinegar Hill, and most of the rebels there are sent to New South Wales as their punishment, those that aren't killed on the battlefield or hanged or whatever. So when they arrive, we start to get a real fear here in New South Wales and in Parramatta of what these Irish convicts are capable of, what they bring with them in the form of the capacity to initiate a rebellious phase here amongst the convicts. And we see that coming out when Hunter leaves and Governor King comes in. And King's greatest fear is a rebellion by the Irish convicts, which does happen, of course, in 1804. But from the beginning of King's governorship, he is always on the lookout for rebellious Irish. And so Marsden, as the magistrate, is also drawn into this. And because Marsden moves around, he's going out to Windsor, to Toongabbie, up to Castle Hill, or not Windsor at that stage, the Green Hills, and he's moving around with his sermons. He does hear a lot, and people want to talk to him. So in 1800, he does get word from, I have her somewhere, from a woman that some of the Irish convicts are making and storing pikes. So, the great sticks that go in the ground, you can put people's heads on, you can use as fortifications. So he is under instructions to find out where these pikes are, where they're being hidden. And that brings us to the flogging of Paddy Galvin and Maurice Fitzgerald. So these are two Irish convicts, and Paddy Galvin is only 20 years old. But between Samuel and Richard Atkins, who is judge advocate at that time, they decide to engage in what I call a little bit of state-sanctioned torture.
Wow.
And that is the use of flogging to get a confession out of somebody. So Paddy Galvin started off with 30 lashes, and they were to be delivered on his back. And that was sanctioned. That was the if you would call the punishment, trying to
A
find
normal
out
sentence for
That's
what
right.
he'd done. Yeah.
exactly. So they're trying to find out exactly where these pipes are. But the problem is they decide not to stop at 30 because Paddy's not going to give up. And they go to his bottom, so his buttock cheeks, and he is delivered of another 30. And he cannot, at this time, sit down. I've got sorry. This is what happens when I have things all over the place and my mind moves. Sorry, Jennifer.
So he's had 30 on the back and now they've moved to the breech.
They have, yes, the breech, sorry. The belly. And he still isn't going to tell where the pipes are. The thing is, though, nobody knows that these pipes actually exist, whether they exist or not. So, and that is, in a way, the theory behind torture, isn't it? You're not 100% sure that the information you're trying to get is accurate, but you're going to try and get it anyway. And so the next slot is on the back of his calves.
Oh.
So there's another 30 to, in the end, it's estimated he's had 100 lashes all over his body.
And they're very, back then, they were very strict, well, where you got your lashes.
Yes, exactly.
You know, children got lashed on the breech, adults got lashed on the back. Around the calves, that's not standard. That's not legal.
No, it's not standard and legal. And therein lies one of the issues with that. And people who were critical of Marsden at that time continued throughout his whole career to point out back to this particular episode.
Was there any repercussions from that? Like, did he get in trouble for that?
No, because neither of them did, neither he nor Atkins as such, because as I said, it fed back into Governor King's fear of an Irish uprising. So they kind of
turned a blind eye to that.
Well, that's why I mentioned, for me, state-sanctioned torture, because King is not saying that this is the wrong thing to do, because he himself is in such a state. It's a massive fear for him that the Irish will rise up whilst he is governor. And when the uprising does happen, the reason, or one of the reasons, that we actually have very, very little record of that uprising at Castle Hill from government sources is that King did not really send a report back to London. He minimised it to the extent that if you don't go looking for these things, you really have no idea that it's occurred. So.
And what about the victim who got these lashes? Did he give anything away?
No, nothing.
No,
absolutely nothing. And that's what I was trying to look for, because there was a great point made that he actually said, Paddy Galvin was saying, I'm not going to tell you anything. I would rather die than tell you what you want to know. And that's interesting, because it means, for me, it was like, well, did he know? Did he know where they were? And he's not going to say, or is he just teasing them?
Yeah.
You know, and just saying, you can do anything to me, but I'm not going to help you out at all. So that was the biggest contributor to where the flogging parson came from.
But was that term, like, who came up with that term? Do we know? Is that something that's come about now, or is it something that, like, he had this reputation in the colony, but yeah.
He did. That was the nickname given to him at the time in the 1790s.
Right.
And because as a magistrate, when you came before him during the week, that was the standard punishment for what you had done. You had the stocks for very, very minor things. You had floggings and you had hangings. They also, of course, as we know from the penal colony system, they could send you even further out, say to Newcastle, Coal River, even up to what's now Brisbane, Moreton Bay. But floggings were easy. They were done fairly quickly.
And it meant that the convicts could get back to work quickly.
Exactly, because it was not a punishment designed to physically make you incapable of work. So, you know, and I love when I used to do the night tours in Parramatta, and we spoke about flogging there in Prince Alfred Park, where the triangle was often put, or most often put. And I would tell people, you know, I'd point out, because they go, what happened to people afterwards, you know? And they would be taken across the river back to the little tent hospital, where salt, of course, would be applied to the wounds, because it's the only like antiseptic that you have. And you were given a couple of days, and then, you know, you were put back to work. So, yeah. But that's where it came from. So the Paddy Galvin torture case was basically where he got the nickname the Flogging Parson from, and it just came from the Irish convicts, as far as we know. So we don't have a name for who gave, well, not that I found anyway, a name for who gave it to him. So yeah. But it's
I find that when you talk about Samuel Marsden, people either love him or hate him, and that's definitely, you know, the flogging side is definitely a really awful side. Can you tell me a bit about the good side, the humanitarian? I believe he did a lot for the Female Factory and women travelling out to Australia.
Yeah, so again, it sort of starts with Governor King. King established an orphan school for girls on Norfolk Island, and when he came back, when he and his wife came back to Sydney, he established the orphan school in Sydney, and that was then transferred to become a larger orphan school at Parramatta. And it wasn't until the orphan school arrived in Parramatta that Marsden became involved with that as a trustee. But before that, he was, I suppose, commissioned to oversee the building of the brick jail or stone jail in Parramatta. And no thought had ever been given to what was going to happen to convict women out here in the colony. So as a convict woman, when you arrived, you were basically assigned, out in Parramatta anyway, to what we call convict huts. And one woman to each convict hut, and they were supposed to do the cooking, the cleaning, you know, looking after their assigned up to 12 convict men in these little huts. So the transportation itself, as you know, was the punishment rather than actually what happened to you out here in New South Wales. So Marsden was, when he was building this stone jail, the top level then became a spinning area for yarn, for wool, and Marsden was quite worried about what happened to these women at night, because that particular room upstairs could only hold maybe 30 women at night time. It was not built as a form of asylum or place for them to be. So the worry became, what did they do at night? Where did they go? Where did they sleep? And again, you're looking at his background as a minister and worrying about the morals of the female convicts, you know, and their safety as well. It all builds in to that. And so he started to, I suppose, look at other ways in which to look after them. So, sorry, just lost my train of thought. The early jail, that first one in Prince Alfred, held the women upstairs. The women who would find lodgings in Parramatta as best they could. But it wasn't until, whilst King was here, there weren't that many sort of women in the barracks situation. You know, they were out on assignment, they could be assigned, they were finding work. It's when Lachlan Macquarie arrives and the barracks situation takes over for men with Hyde Park Barracks, as you
Yep.
know, and not much. It's like the women are forgotten, especially the women at Parramatta. And at its height, I think Marsden was complaining that there were up to 150 women trying to find accommodation in Parramatta in that top floor of that first jail. And that's when he started writing to Elizabeth Fry, started sending letters back, asking, you know, what can we do for these women? How should we be looking after them? But he also approached Lachlan Macquarie, and he was telling Macquarie that, you know, these particular setups in Parramatta here were not enough to look after the women. And he wasn't getting anywhere with Macquarie. And again, you've got to go right back to when Macquarie arrives. And up until Lachlan Macquarie, Samuel Marsden had been working with governors who were receptive to his ideas, who didn't pose too much resistance to what he did. But Lachlan Macquarie was slightly different. And some people would suggest, or have suggested, that because of his position as a military man, he took any sort of opposition as a form of insubordination. As governor. So that's just one particular argument. And again, Lachlan Macquarie is quite a divisive, or is becoming now a divisive figure, because people are looking more into his actions out here in the colony and what he did. So it's probably safe to say that Samuel couldn't, with the female convicts at Parramatta, he had to work behind the scenes to get the new jail off and running. But he had more, say, input into how the Female Orphan School was set up and run, in that his relationship with Elizabeth Fry led to the orphan school being the first place in the British Empire taking in girls from true orphans, girls whose parents were in incarceration, were both convicts, girls whose families couldn't look after them.
Yeah.
In giving them a future. And that was done by Samuel questioning what was going to happen to these girls once they left. So he worked with Elizabeth Fry to set up a system where, for the first time, the girls were able to be taught to read, to write, and do basic mathematics, basic arithmetic. And they were also taught trades. So the orphan school at Parramatta trained the girls up in various occupations. So nursery maid, dairy maid, scullery. They taught them to sew. They gave them skills that once they were rejected from the orphanage at the age of 13, they could take with them to provide an income for themselves. And
to give them a good start in the community. Exactly.
And that was something that had not been done anywhere else. And that's not to say that Marsden was perfect, or, you know, he was the great social reformer in particular for me, for the orphan school, but that he saw a need and he worked with someone who could provide answers for that need. Because when you think about it, as a Church of England minister, his job is to, or the way he viewed his job was to keeping people on the straight and narrow, on the good life too. And you can't just do that, as he worked out over the years, by telling them that was the way to be. You actually had to provide a basis for them to achieve those goals. So, and the Female Orphan School at Parramatta showed that you could achieve those goals. And in fact, Elizabeth MacArthur was a great, you could call her a friend of the Female Orphan School, in that whenever she had a requirement for for girls to come and start in what we today would call an entry-level position in work. Her first call was the Female Orphan School across the river. And in fact, it was the youngest Marsden daughter, Martha, who was the last of the matrons at the Female Orphan School as well. So that connection was maintained. So at the
and was he still a magistrate at this time?
No, he'd been removed from the bench.
Right. And was that because of that illegal flogging?
No.
Or just his time came to an end?
No. It was part of his public roads. Hang on a minute. Scheme. I told you my brain when it comes to Samuel Marsden is just all over the place. Now, he was removed from the bench twice.
Oh.
Not permission to carry. One of them was to do with his, in this case, one of them was the Douglas case, 1819. Sorry, I'll have to edit
What was he doing the wrong thing? Is that why he was removed? Or
they were, yes. So the Douglas case.
Did you get training to do this role?
No, we didn't have any. So what it was in the Douglas case was, oh God, hang on, sorry about this. My brain has just gone to absolute mush, and even though I've got it here in front of me. So basically, he had the misconduct in that case was there was a witness, Anne Rumsby, who was a female convict. Yeah, so you probably know the case, but in order to protect, I don't know whether it was to protect Douglas or whatever, but he actually had her charged and sent to the factory, even though she was a witness in the case. No, it's not gelling to me. Powerful, making himself a powerful enemy with Douglas. Fine, 10 shillings. That's right, James Ring. The other time he was removed from the bench, I'm pretty sure, was the case of James Ring, who was a servant who he let abscond. So, yes, yeah. Sorry, that's just.
So I believe he went to New Zealand at some point too in his career.
He did. So the New Zealand, spreading the gospel in New Zealand was, I suppose.
Was this his idea, or did he have an appointment over there? Or
no, sorry, Jennifer, I've just gone a bit. Yeah. Anyway, so again, we've got to come back to before we understand why he went to New Zealand. One of the reasons, again, that Samuel took on New South Wales was the desire to bring the gospel to the native inhabitants,
right,
of Australia. And that was, it would have been exciting for a missionary. So a brand new group of people who are going to be, you're going to be able to convert over to Christianity. But the problem was when Samuel arrives in New South Wales, and he discovers through he and his family, like a lot of colonial families at the time, often would take on an Aboriginal child, to raise as part of their family. That's what they said, but usually it was just, basic servant type relationship. And with Samuel, he finally came to realize that after a few years, even though Aboriginal children would take, they would read, they would write, they would take on what you would call a sheen of Englishness, they still, and this message comes through to us today, they still needed to be what is called on country and with their families. So they found out that you could take Aboriginal children away, but you couldn't keep them. And when Samuel tried to preach to Aboriginal families, Aboriginal people around Parramatta, he found that apart from the acts, there really wasn't anything that Aboriginal people wanted from Europeans. So, you know, an axe is useful. Their society was not based on trade for commerce as such.
Yeah.
And that was the main way that church missionaries operated, by spreading the gospel. They worked best when the societies already had a basic understanding of trade and consumerism. So that's why the South Pacific was targeted. And Samuel worked out during a couple of visits to England, in which he came across New Zealand Maori who were in London, that they had a similar culture, so that they would be very happy to engage in trade. So when Samuel goes to New Zealand, he actually has he's raised funds to start a mission in New Zealand.
Did Elizabeth go with him?
I think she went the second time.
Right.
He went to New Zealand.
And how many kids did they end up having?
7.
Wow. So she had a hands full back home.
She did. And they lost the first 2 sons.
Right.
So 3 boys and 4 daughters, and the first 2 sons, Charleses, they lost. One of them was thrown from a carriage as they were coming up the parsonage, or they were coming up what we call the Western Road, which is the Great Western Highway, at Parramatta there, and the carriage flipped and died, and the second one fell into a pot of boiling water in the kitchen. I know, suffering.
Oh, that's awful.
It is awful. And those 2 boys are buried in the family crypt in St John's Cemetery.
And where is Marsden?
He's in the family crypt at St John's Cemetery. So it's chocker with Marsdens, Betts, Bobarts, everybody who married into the family. So Elizabeth is there, Samuel is there, daughters and their husbands are there. It's probably about 4 meters square.
So they must have a lot of descendants living in Australia still?
They do. So descendants in the Bathurst area, descendants, of course, even in contemporary Sydney, we all know John Marsden, lawyer and author. And on one tour I did, which talked about Samuel, I had 2 descendants on that tour, and they were, I suppose I was privileged to be able to chat with them, because every year the Marsden family in New South Wales has a big get together.
Oh, okay.
And they have, and I was able to show them the rose garden at Macarthur Girls High. That was Samuel's largest, I wouldn't say largest, but the most prominent land grant he had, where he did build a house for he and Elizabeth to live, but they never actually moved in. She died in, I think, 1834, and then he died in 1838. But I was able to show them where the house was, and the rose garden that sort of was in front of the school when I was there, and still was a few years ago, that sort of delineates the whole front section of the house and where it looked out onto the river. So, yeah. And
he's a very interesting character. He's done good deeds and bad deeds. And
he has. And I apologise if that was a bit of a travel through, as Doctor Who would call it, bit timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly. But
well, there's just so much. We could talk for hours on him. He's had such a colourful life. So it's hard to sort of get it down to.
But look, I do want to actually say just one more thing. So as much as Samuel was a divisive character, he really he met a nemesis in Lachlan Macquarie. And most of Samuel's troubles came during that period when Macquarie was here, because Samuel said no to running the native institution that Macquarie wanted to set up. And he did that because he said the Aboriginal people, the native peoples out here, have no need for Anglicanism for education. They don't want anything from us. And in Samuel's mind, that meant that they could no longer play a role in his evangelical spreading of the gospel. So, you know, people say he hated Aboriginal people, but I don't think he did. He just didn't see a space for them in what his job was, which is why he went to New Zealand. He found that. And he also said no to Macquarie when it came to sitting on a commission for overseeing public roads, because, and he found out about this through the newspaper, an article in the Gazette saying Samuel Marsden is, or Reverend Samuel Marsden is appointed, but the two other men he was with were emancipated convicts. And people, oh, he hates emancipates, you know, all this. Marsden wrote back and said to Macquarie, it's not that they are emancipated convicts, because he let his own emancipated convict, James Ring, escape off to New Zealand, but that they are living in sin. And that is why I will not sit with them. Samuel was often accused of being more interested in matters of financial interest. So the farming, the purchase of a boat, raising money for the Church Missionary Society, these were all seen as negatives, as opposed to him focusing on his core job as the Anglican minister and the senior Anglican minister. And on one trip back to London, he was supposed to bring a whole lot of books back for a free lending library in Parramatta.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of those books were never seen outside the parsonage.
Right.
So, yeah. So anyway, all of this culminates in 1817 because Macquarie can't attack him personally, can't be seen to be attacking. So he has his secretary, John Campbell, write a letter to the Sydney Gazette, which is called signed Philo Free, you know, and it attacks Marsden for the way he makes money from the Church Missionary Society by charging for the use of his boat, the Active. It alludes to trading of muskets and powder by his missionaries in New Zealand. It's a very sarcastic, like it's all done sarcastically.
Yeah.
You know, and it also complains about the missing books for the library, and that really seals the whole deal with Macquarie and Marsden's relationship. It never really recovers, even though Macquarie does put him on these boards for the factory, for the orphan school. The damage is done as far as Marsden's concerned, and it forms the basis of the first ever libel case brought to the courts in Sydney. And Campbell is found guilty of libel. So, but for me, that is just as a sort of a student of Macquarie's actions as well. It's an interesting twist or an early twist of how you use the media, how the media was used and government officials were used to attack at that stage a, you know, sort of public/private citizen from the government. So nothing's new in New South Wales.
Can I just ask, what did Commissioner Big think of Samuel Marsden?
I don't think he personally liked him, but he agreed with, and he used a lot of Marsden's letters back to London. That's what drew Big, one of the things that drew Big out here to New South Wales was Marsden's constant criticising under the guise of wanting to assist, wanting to help. You know, how can we help, you know, reform in New South Wales? But the constant criticism of Macquarie's administration were what drew Big out here to New South Wales. Was what
interesting.
Yeah, and he, of course, had a lot to say about Governor Macquarie. And I think it was probably one of the few times in that period that John MacArthur and Samuel Marsden came together as well in criticism of Lachlan Macquarie and how he was running the colony. So, yeah. So he did play a big part in that. And yeah, so thank you for listening.
Thank you for coming on the show. This has just been fascinating.
I hope so. As I said, there's so much, really so much, and so many divisive opinions.
Yes, it's
about Marsden.
People either love him or hate him.
They do, and I haven't found a middle ground. I think some of the things the man did were unconscionable, and I think there was a part of him that didn't want to admit that what he was doing went against every ounce of training he had as an Anglican minister. But I also understand the desire to set his family up with a large family like that, you know, and the massive land grants he still have. The only property we have two properties left, I suppose, that are associated with Samuel Marsden, and one is St John's Church in Parramatta, St John's Cathedral. All that's left of Marsden's church that Marsden would recognise today are the two spires and the clock.
Right.
Yeah, his original church from 1803 just sort of crumbled and fell down, and it wasn't his fault. He didn't build it, but he recognised that. And the house at Mamre at St Mary's.
Okay.
So the two-storey sort of colonial Georgian two-storey double pile cottage that's on that site there.
So where can people, if they want to read up more about Samuel Marsden, can you recommend a book or any way they can start their research to have a more balanced view of his life? Like, there's a lot of books out there that are very negative and really talk about him as the flogging parson, but is there books that are a bit more balanced that show the good and the bad so we can make our own decisions? Okay, my starting point would be Sandy Yarwood. So that is Samuel Marsden, The Great Survivor by A.T. Yarwood. And but again, as I said earlier, Sandy does have a propensity to gloss over some of the negatives. There is probably in the last few years, this book has come out called The Flesh, the Devil. It's hard to see, sorry. So The World, the Flesh and the Devil, the Life and Opinions of Samuel Marsden in England and the Antipodes. I have not broken this one yet because, as you can see, it's about 10 centimetres thick. Yeah. There is Samuel Marsden, Alter Ego by Richard Quinn, and that is the one that is super, super, super negative of Samuel Marsden. You can also go to the New Zealand History Trust, has some great articles on Marsden's influence in New Zealand. Strangely enough, the Lachlan Macquarie resource papers at Macquarie University have a great deal about Samuel Marsden. You've got historical journals of Australia and New South Wales will have the direct. Yeah, the Mitchell Library has his journal of his time on the First Fleet. And I'm going to, as soon as we finish this, I'm going to go and check out the wedding dress of Elizabeth.
So, it should be, last time I looked, it was, they actually had the wedding dresses from that collection online. And, of course, there are the Marsden family papers held in the State Library.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much.
That's okay. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And I hope we can get you back on the show again sometime.
For more ramblings. I would love that, Jennifer. Yes.
Thank you. All right. Bye, Michelle.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Convict Australia podcast. If you'd like to show your appreciation and get more involved, there are a number of ways you can. The first is by signing up to Convict Australia on Patreon, and you will get some perks like the Convict Australia Newsletter. Secondly, leave a review and tell your friends and family. This really does make a huge difference. And lastly, join the Facebook and Instagram group Convict Australia. All the links I've mentioned will be in the show notes. Thank you again. Till next time.